Hey, this is Cyrus from Newfound Glory, and you're listening to Epic Footnote.
Hey guys, what's going on? It's There Goes Mike Herrera. I'm Matt.
And I'm Zach.
One of our 2 new interview series. You clicked on the picture, you know who it is. We interviewed Cyrus from Newfound Glory. It was a dream interview, at least for me. It was so good to just get a chance to sit down and talk to Cyrus about a whole bunch of different things. And Zach, what did we go into with him?
We got to go into the new album, Forever and Ever Times Infinity, which is a really great reminder of how Newfound Glory is really one of the pinnacle punk rock bands of the past 2 decades, if not longer. And even just getting to hear a little bit more about working with Steve Evetts, really great producer. But it was also really special to hear him talk about meeting MXPX for the first time. I joked that it was a great advertisement for Denny's, but just hearing how his fandom for the band led to actually becoming not just friends, but in a way, bandmates with Mike from MXPX, and then getting to hear a lot. I mean, Goldfinger doesn't really get a lot of credit for their impact in the rock scene. So getting to hear how that relationship evolved and getting to play in Goldfinger. And also, not to spoil it, but to hear one particular musician that he got to meet at the Kerrang Awards was a lot of fun. It might have involved alcohol, no spoilers. And then also, to me, it's funny, we did a past episode of If You Have to Pick 3 on the bands that best defined Warped Tour. And I was really interested to hear what Cyrus, which bands he would name, because, you can make the argument that Newfound Glory is high up on that list too of bands that really made an impact on what Warped Tour really stood for. And I was, not to gloat, but he agreed with us on Less Than Jake. And just to hear that relationship between Newfound Glory and how Less Than Jake really impacted them was really special. But you know what? Without further ado, give the episode a listen yourself. Let us know what you think on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Epic Footnote, and stay tuned for part 2 of our interview with Cyrus. Thanks for listening and enjoy.
See ya.
You're quarantined now. Where actually are you? You're with your mom, but where?
Okay, so I'm in Hollywood, Florida right now.
Okay.
I'm in the home I grew up in. I'm in my mom's house. I feel like a teenager again because my mom's not here. I have the house all to myself, but this is
party.
I'm in quarantine, right? So no, it's not party. I mean, if I want it's a Zoom party, right? How fun is that? I'm quarantining because Newfound Glory, we just recently released a record. We did a live stream. I traveled to Nashville for that. And in my house, my wife is a high-risk person, if you want to call it. So
oh, wow.
We've been taking this, I guess, a little more seriously than maybe most people, or at least I've been all of us have been very cautious, my family, that is. And so traveling last week, it was just making sure that everything, taking as much precaution as I could. And this was part of it. So it was the idea that even though I'm gone for a week, it's going to be almost 3 weeks. And it has been. I didn't go back home. I did go and see my kids, but it was the whole wave to them from outside the window thing. I live about 30 minutes here. Yeah, but it's okay. I took a test. I'm negative. All that stuff is good. And I'll go back.
That's good news.
That is really good.
Yeah. Now with that, I mean, you're a real estate agent, and right now, at least here in New Jersey, real estate's kind of hot. But now you brought up that, you're quarantining. Were you doing any sort of real estate in the time, where you weren't quarantining, or, during the time of recording the album because it is so hot right now?
Yeah. Yes to everything. And ironic you say that. I was going to try to make that one of my, fibs or truths, but you guys know, so you killed that one. That's fine. I got a lot there. So I am a real estate agent. Thanks for bringing that up. I try to incorporate real estate into my life as much as I can. However, one of the greatest things about real estate is it's the kind of career where you don't have to go to an office every day. You can literally turn it on and off like a switch, which I hate to use that, but that's been actually thrown out there with the pandemic, right?
Yeah,
it's true. You turn on and off like a switch. And so when I'm home, I try to do real estate here locally in South Florida. When I travel, I try to do real estate as far as referrals, and I can refer people all over the country. And I've done some of that. Specifically pandemic-wise, though, I was actually working with somebody here in South Florida right as things started getting pretty bad. And he was all set. It was a person who just needed to rent something because his lease was up. And all of a sudden, he loses his job because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Radio station. And they basically cleared house because they couldn't have anybody in the office. and it was hard for them to get people to do remote. And that's it. That deal's gone. And he didn't get a job right away. It took him a while. I don't even know if he's got one right now. He had to move back in with his parents, and there goes that deal. So I felt that effect really quick. And then, like I said, unfortunately, with my wife being high risk and then real estate not being my primary career, there was no reason for me to push to do it. But South Florida is a hot market as well. I mean, I read today, South Florida in general, but it feels like South Florida. But Florida and Texas are the two states with most people moving daily. Here.
Yeah, it's really it's so crazy because I moved and we started looking for a house way before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit and it's like there's no houses anymore. I mean, I thought people were supposed to be locked away, and then we found our house. And then the only reason we found our house sounded exactly like what you just said, is somebody lost their job. And then we ended up, getting the house and moving in. So, I mean, it's just crazy. I never thought the real estate market would be so hard to find a house when you're supposed to stay inside.
True. But, it's a supply and demand thing. And before the pandemic, at least in Florida, the inventory was low, meaning that there actually weren't as many houses on the market. So if people want to buy, which rates, again, pre-pandemic, mortgage rates were historically low, and they've only gotten lower, which is insane. But, this idea of rates being pretty low makes it somewhat affordable to get a house in the big picture. It's kind of hard now because a lot of people, unfortunately, have lost jobs or their jobs have changed or whatnot. But the inventory is not there. So prices have gone up, even though it's more affordable. It's this really, really weird, complex thing. As a real estate agent, you play both sides because you do help buyers and sellers. So there's somebody who wants to buy. Hey, look, the time's now because the rates are good. Somebody who wants to sell. You should sell now because your house is probably appreciated in value. And it kind of goes both ways. But, real estate is real estate, and it's not going anywhere. In fact, in Florida, very quickly, now some of this is economic, but very quickly the real estate associations fought to make themselves essential. Their idea was always have to live somewhere. I mean, I think it's a little crazy, but, that's it, when you really think about it, it's true.
Well, listen, not to diss Florida, but if Florida can say pro wrestling is an essential business, I would argue yes, real estate is an essential business too.
Yeah, very true. There's a lot of things though that we need to do before we worry about even real estate or wrestling. We got to tackle the problem at hand right now because it's getting out of control here.
Yeah, we're still in the midst in New Jersey with everything going on with COVID, and now Florida's seeing spikes. How is it just seeing it firsthand?
Well, I mean, like you said, you guys have gone through it, and it looks like just the Northeast in general has seemed to have weathered the storm and at least come to grips with how to deal with it or dealt with it already. I know in some ways the reopenings, I think in Jersey specifically, you do have, people that just, they go nuts. Once everything's open, it's like, oh, let's go back to normal. And it's not going to be like that. It can't be like that right now. But Florida, it's just one of those where it kind of, I think, mimics the national picture. It's unfortunate. It's a large state. And I totally understand. Here in South Florida is one thing. When you live in like the panhandle of Florida, that's like a 10-hour drive away. It feels like a completely different area of the country. And so it would be unfair to clamp down on some of those people when it's really concentrated in some of these other areas of Florida. But specifically where I live in South Florida, I mean, it's pretty bad here. And you really have to take things seriously. And we've put all those mandates back in for facial coverings and whatnot. And, that was one of the things when I went to Nashville trying to explain to people, I'm not going to come from Florida to Nashville. And just because, at least at the time, 2 weeks ago, Nashville, it seemed to be okay. I'm not going to just run around like nothing's happening. I'm going to continue to do what I do in Florida because I don't want to bring it back. And that's the kind of things I think is starting to happen here. Not only are we reopening, but people are starting to travel here again and whatnot and coming from other areas because they like the beaches and whatnot. And that's how diseases go around, I guess. It doesn't take a medical degree to figure that out.
I must believe that it's kind of crazy to think about how you're not even going on tour. You're just going to another city to take care of some promo, and you still have to take these precautions. It's just a sign of the crazy times that we live in right now.
Yeah, it is. And it's sad because we can't go on tour at all. And the most we could do was do this live stream, which was very, very successful all around.
Congrats on the success of that, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. But it was still, it was surreal in a lot of ways. And like, I was talking to some of the other like musicians we are around and just some of our crew members. It's like nobody knows how to react, especially in this industry, because, in some industries, yes, the office is closed. and now they're reopening, and maybe not everybody's in the office. Some people working at home. But in music, it's like, it's one of those things where every time you see somebody, you like give them a hug because it's the guy you haven't seen since 6-7 months ago on tour, or, you know, you got to go play a show and do this, and you're supposed to meet all these fans, and there's 100 people, you know, outside waiting. None of that was going on, you know, and even like musicians I was seeing that I haven't seen in weeks or months, it's like, hey, how you doing? And it almost comes off as if you're cold, but you can't even, like, you're not even supposed to fist bump, right? The elbow thing, everybody's like ruled out all that stuff. Just stay 6 feet apart.
It's so weird to even when Zach and I, we met up like a week or two ago, and it's like, oh, you know, normally give him a hug, a handshake. Now it's like, oh, wait, how do I interact with a guy who I talk to all the time? You know, it's insane. Like just to think that it's come down to this. But let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about, you know, the new album, Forever and Ever Times Infinity. So on other views that I've heard you on, other interviews that I've heard you on, you talk about different nuances that happen on like some of the earlier albums that you guys did, like on Sticks and Stones. Mark Hoppus played bass on Something I Call Personality, or on The Story So Far, you talk about your basses and you kind of trading instruments for like the first couple of notes on the song. Did anything like that happen on the new album?
Let me see. No, I don't believe so. So making this record was a little different. And the reason why it was different was because if you want to compare it to Sticks and Stones, for instance, that was 19 years ago we recorded that. We were 21 years old. We had just moved out to California. You know, where none of us had anything but, I don't even think we had cell phones back then. Maybe we had just gotten a cell phone or something, you know? So it's like there's no ties to anything. There's no responsibilities. So we're just all hanging out in the studio, literally living together, all that stuff. Now everybody has their own lives. Everybody has wives or families, kids, all that stuff. So making this record was a little different. We wrote most of the record on tour, which is not that uncommon for us nowadays. Right. But when we went to go actually record the record, well, for myself and Ian, who still live here in Florida, you know, we had to leave, and we had to leave for what was going to be about 3 or 4 weeks. And you spend the first 10 or so days kind of finishing up the writing and then go into the studio. I actually, on this record, I recorded my drums and then left the next day, and I went on tour at Goldfinger in the UK. Oh, wow. Yeah, and that was something that was scheduled before we had the record scheduled. And I've always told John and the Goldfinger guys, and they were super, super, you know, understanding and supportive of it. You know, I can't ever conflict with Newfound Glory. Like, Newfound Glory is my bread and butter. That's my band. And they're cool with it. But it worked out for me to get on a plane 12 hours after wrapping up in the studio and fly to London and start a UK tour with them. But it was a little different for me because I left the studio, and I left for about 2 weeks. And then I came home to my house because I needed to be able to see my kids and stuff for a few days and then go back. So I was gone for about 2.5 weeks on this record. And because of what I did, everybody else was like, you know what, let's try that this time. How about everybody kind of just comes in when they need to? And then at the end, we'll spend about a week so that we can all figure out if there's finishing touches. Because for the most part, that's what we do. People just do their stuff, you know, like everybody might be there in the studio, but we figure out so much of this stuff ahead of time that it's like when I'm there doing my drums, I'm just playing what I'm supposed to be playing. And the writing part of it is the week before. That's a collaborative effort. I'm trying to think if there was anything weird happening on this or anything guest wise. And no, I mean, it was really just us. We all did do the group vocals, the like shouting that you hear. Right. That is us. That happened in the last couple of days. And we had some of our friends and like old guitar tech of ours and some of the guys that used to be in the band Strong Arm and Further Seems Forever that now live in Tennessee. So there's cool faces in there. If you saw any of the behind the scenes videos, you might have seen some. Right. Yeah. That's probably the coolest thing. Sorry.
No, it's cool. Well, you know, it's funny you mentioned about the behind the scenes stuff, because one of the things that I was kind of geeking out over was learning that you actually use some pretty famous snare drums, including the snare drum that was used to record November Rain by Guns N' Roses, the snare drum
it's the same model. It's the same model. I don't want to claim I actually have it. I've seen it and I've used that specific drum you're talking about. But the guy who owns that's not going to give it to me.
I was going to say that that's still very cool. But now maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. One of the snare drums that you did use on the album was also used on the Black album.
So same thing. It's
by Metallica, or same thing, the same model.
Yes, because there's obviously most of these snares, almost every snare in existence, there's been more than one created. But you know what was just a snare you would find in the stores, and maybe it wasn't like your $50 Sears model. I think that's where a lot of people used to get their drums back in the like 60s and 70s, right? You know, it would be like a pretty mid to almost pro snare, but just a pro, like it would be like buying a Gibson Les Paul guitar. It's just a pro guitar.
No, yeah, that makes sense.
That this specific model just becomes one of the most famous snares in history. And because of that, it totally appreciates and all that stuff. You're right. So I used a drum. It's a Tama Bell Brass, and that is the same drum, the same kind of drum that was used on the Black Album, Deftones, I believe. Probably Foo Fighters used it. I mean, you name it. It was the drum of the 90s. That's the big bad drum. It's
still cool to know that you used that kind of, because to me, nothing against New Found Glory, but when you hear the band name, you don't necessarily immediately think of Metallica or Guns N' Roses and Rage Against the Machine. But I also know that you were very heavily influenced by especially the Black Album and Metallica. So I'm wondering if like using that model, that influenced any of the way that you approached the drums for this album.
Totally. It wouldn't even just be this album, our career. And we'll say it all the time. You know, there's more than one person in this band, right? And although we could, when hard pressed, probably find one or two bands that we all agree upon. Usually Green Day is one of them. Like those are the bands that influenced us, right? But we're not just a Green Day ripoff or anything. And one of the reasons why we, I think, have been successful and have such a unique sound, or at least it was a unique sound that then inspired a generation, is because of this melting pot of all of us and where we came from. And I was by far the most alternative radio kid out of all of us. The rest of the guys, and sometimes it's almost embarrassing to admit this, or at least it's kind of sad to admit it, that the rest of these guys like totally knew about like underground kind of emo and punk rock and all that. And for me, I wrote off some of that. I had some friends. Those are the friends that I kind of talked to but didn't hang out with, that were into the punk music and listening to like, or watching the skate videos that had like old Fat Records and Epitaph record stuff on it. But I didn't really like that music. The most I liked was like Goldfinger Here in Your Bedroom. Why? Because it was on MTV, you know, or even like when I first heard MXPX or No Effects or Face to Face, I always came off listening and was like, that sounds like 17 of the same song. Like, it's just not interesting. And so I was a radio kid. And it's ironic you mentioned this because about an hour ago, I was just hanging here setting up this Skype stuff. And I turned on Spotify. One of my favorite playlists is the 90s alternative playlist. And I mean, it's basically the radio station that I grew up listening to, the rock radio station, which is no longer here in South Florida. It is what they played. So it's Foo Fighters, it's Silverchair, it's Korn, it's, you know, and then the lighter stuff, right? Like Sponge, and I can name all these bands, but I know all those songs. And I know all the music to the song. That's the big thing. Like, I know the drum beats and all that. So that's where this influence comes from. You know, it's something that Lars would do on a Black Album. Yes, our music doesn't really sound like Metallica, but there's nuances. You know, Lars, he liked to use these crashes, and the crash wasn't just where it normally is with the drummer, which is on the downbeat, if you know what I'm talking about, at the beginning of the measure. With the snare, it's little accents. He loves his China. He does all this stuff. And, you know, yeah, I can't help but probably pull influence from that.
That's awesome. And, you know, going off again on, you know, being in the studio, working with Steve Evetts, who has the reputation, I guess is a good way to say it, of pushing his bands a little bit over the edge sometimes. And I've heard you talk about some of the ways that he made you think outside the box when it came to recording on this album. How do you feel working with him helped make you a stronger, not just maybe a stronger performer, but maybe even a stronger producer? Because I know you do a lot of work in the studio. How did that improve your skills?
Well, it was refreshing to see somebody like Steve, because he approaches things in a very analog, like old school way. You know, it's cliche to say, but it's true. Nowadays, as time goes on, a lot of producers, they just forget about this, right? And their computers and technology have come up where you could have a little tiny box and one microphone and make a record that sounds just as good as ours, I guess, right? But even though at the end of the day, the two things could be the same, somebody with a box and a computer and somebody with a huge studio, Steve likes the old school way, which is put up some extra mics if you need to, try to find where it sounds the best in the room, use a whole bunch of different snare drums, and get the best performance. And then, you know, move on from there. And so it started even in writing or pre-production, where we would like kind of put everything together, just suggesting things with drums that I would never think of, like using crashes as like another drum almost, you know, and I wouldn't do what Lars would do, which is You crash on the downbeats if you need to, and you do these little accents. And he's like, no, why don't you play like a rhythm with the crashes? And I'm like, you're never going to hear that. And it's debatable whether you actually do or not in the record, but it opened up ideas. It let me, because I love in my drumming parts, if you were to, let's say, maybe just listen to them by themselves or be able to analyze them, that they kind of build on each other. It gets bigger and bigger towards the end, right? Or it gets more complex. And so Steve was good at like figuring things like that out, or at least giving me suggestions to make me think in that way. And
it's funny, you mentioned about the analog approach to recording. And you can make the argument that that's some of the best work from the 90s alt genre that you love so much. That's how they approached it as well.
No, totally. And actually, some of those records, when you listen to them now, it's like they're so raw, and there's not much going on. And then I wish, I wish our next record we could do that. But you know what? We wouldn't sound good comparatively, right? Everybody would be like, "What happened to Newfound Glory? They sound like a garage band or something." But go listen to like Weezer, the Blue album. It's like two guitars, and it's just this weird fuzzy distortion tone or whatever. And it's not perfect, but it sounds awesome. And it's like the drums are super dry and all this. And, but that was, I think at the time, that's just what worked. And we've been around for over 20 years now, right? So that's one thing is we've been trying to kind of like, we don't purposely change with the time, but we always want to sound like Newfound Glory. But if, everybody's out there using fake drums and fake this and whatever, well, we got to have a record that kind of sounds like that, but we're going to approach it in the way that we know how to approach it.
That's kind of interesting that you bring that up, because there was another interview that I was listening to where you talked about kind of the progression of Newfound Glory albums. And when you did Resurrection, for me personally, I really love that album, just the way that it sounds. And it sounds like a more simplistic approach. So I think it's very interesting that you say that that you would sound not as good, or it wouldn't sound like Newfound Glory if you go, kind of back to that 90s alternative, like stripped down style. Because for me, at least on that album, it sounded like you guys were very almost stripped back.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I guess you caught me there because you prove a point, which is, it's true. That record, Resurrection, at the time, and I'm sure even still now, like you say, it still sounds big, or it sounds good, or it sounds modern and whatnot. It was really just the instrumentation that was stripped down. And so what I was just saying about the Weezer records and some of these, like the Rage Against the Machine records, it's not only the instrumentation, it's also the way they're mixed. They're mixed very analog. There's not a lot going on there or whatever. And one of the things for Resurrection, what we did, we worked with that record. We produced it along with Paul Miner, who was somebody we'd worked with for a long time. Mm-hmm. He was the engineer on Coming Home with us. He did our From the Screen to Your Stereo Part 2, a whole bunch of B-sides and stuff. Great relationship with him. But then the mixer of that record was a guy, his name is Kyle Black. And Kyle Black does a lot of modern pop punk bands. Right. And so his approach is he's going to take all the tracks and pretty much put his shine on them. And, no two bands are going to sound alike, but they're going to all have the same kind of treatment. So I think that's one of the things that did help it stay modern, even with this like more not generic, but just organic approach, instrumentation.
Yeah, because I love that album. When I heard it, it really felt like, to be completely honest, I didn't listen to you guys for a while, but then I came back to Resurrection, and it really gave me like a new invigoration with the band. Like, it really made me come back and be like, damn, I've been missing like listening to Newfound Glory for a long time. And I went back and, needless to say, listened to the rest of the catalog at that point. But that was really the album for me that kind of brought it back.
Oh, well, thank you. And, I think every record, whether we want to or not, there's some kind of like approach and or theme. And sometimes it's a musical theme. Sometimes the theme just kind of takes on where our career is, right? And it just influences the record in that way. And so, Resurrection, it was a lot of reacting to what was going on in our lives at the time, but it influenced it musically as far as, trying to kind of do the stripped down approach, but still making it big. It should still sound powerful because a band like Pantera was able to do that. Super heavy. Yet they almost never had a guitar solo over guitars. When Dimebag played his solo, it was just Dimebag and Rex, the bass player. That's it, right? So we kind of did that. Or Rage Against the Machine, a lot of time, when Tom Morello is playing a solo, it's him over Timmy C or whatever, the bass player. There's no extra rhythm guitars, and it's still massive, right? Yeah. So that was the idea there. We had one guitar player. We had just gone down to one guitar player, and we really just wanted to make sure that people knew that we still had this core sound. We were still going to sound like ourselves, and maybe even sound a little rougher and bigger, than some of our previous records with one guitar. You know what I mean? It was almost making a point.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So I want to segue into the main theme of this episode, There Goes My Hero, where we talk to our guests about the time they meet their musical idols. I know you had a few stories you want to share, but so what was the first artist you wanted to talk about your first encounter with?
Okay, this one, it's a longer story, but I think it's pretty good. And one of the bands I mentioned before, the band MXPX. Quick history of myself with the band is I had probably maybe heard the name and was like, I don't even understand this name. What's good? There are no effects, right? What's with all these band names like that? My friend was like, hey, let's go see them. They're playing at this club that held like 250 people. And I'm like, sure, I'll go to a show. I'll hang out, whatever. So I'd never heard them before. And he gives me the cassette tape on the way up to the show, plays it. I'm like, yeah, it's pretty good. Saw the show. It was way in the back because I was so intimidated about being in a like super crowded room. And I thought it was awesome. And I really did start enjoying them from that moment on and kind of like dove in with them. So at that time, this would have been like 98 or something, 97, 98, maybe 96. MXPX was always on the Warped Tour, it seemed. It probably was every other year, but they were pretty much always on the Warped Tour along with your bands like Lagwagon and Millencolin and whatnot. I remember going to Warped Tour, seeing them no matter what, if there was an Ernie Ball stage or whatever. And then I think it might have been, I don't know if it was Warped Tour or if it was just another one of their club shows. I went to with my friends, and afterwards we went to the Denny's that we always go to. This is the Denny's here in Hollywood.
Right off the Denny's.
Yeah, and we're sitting there. There's nobody in because it's like 12:30 at night. There's nobody else in there. And in walks these three dudes, and I'm like, oh my God, this is MXPX. Like, this is crazy. And this is like my first time being close to a band. And especially not at a show. And so they sit down, like, again, nobody in the restaurants. They sit like 5-6 tables away from us. I'm just hanging out, and I'm that guy, kind of like trying not to look, and I'm looking. And just, I can't believe it's them. And I keep talking to my friend, should I talk to him? Should I talk to him? And they're egging me on. Yeah, sure. You should, sure. So really quickly, before I go to the next part of the story, the timeline here, I think MXPX had just released the Chick Magnet video. And if you've ever seen that video, that Chick Magnet video is classic. I love it. And it's because Yuri, their drummer, who definitely comes off as like the shy, kind of nerdy guy in the band, he stars in the video as this like Chick Magnet, right? And he's the dude that he goes into a diner type thing, and he sits down and he's like rapping with the girls there, and they're all digging him and stuff. So if you can imagine what happens next, we're in Denny's, pretty much a diner, and they're sitting at a table. I walk up to them casually. I sit down, and Mike, the singer, might have been away from the table talking to somebody. So maybe it was just Tom and Yuri. And I sit across from them because it was open seat, like at their booth. And I sit down and I go, hey guys. And it's just like, what? I go, hey, does this look familiar? And that's all I said. And in my mind, it's like, of course you're going to know. This is the video. How are they going to know this? That's what I'm talking about. I had to explain, what I was doing, and they were not amused. They weren't mad, but they were just like, okay. And then I explained who I was. My mind is going blank here, but I might not have even been in Newfound Glory yet. Because the Newfound Glory might not have been formed yet. Yeah. So this could have been before the band. I was probably playing music, but not in the band. So I just said on Cyrus, I'm a fan or whatever. And they were like, okay, cool. And I was like, all right, that's cool. So that was kind of my first time meeting them, right? Like making a fool of myself. And the only reason why I wanted to include that story was because they're so intertwined with our career at so many different points, all the way until now, when playing with Goldfinger, Mike is almost always there as the bass player. And Mike and myself have totally bonded. And, for a long time, I couldn't really talk to them. They're such huge influences, or at least big musicians for me, that I'm a shy guy. I couldn't really talk to him. And now it's like, Mike's a really good friend of mine. I hang out with him, talk to him about anything, go to a bar or whatever, like you name it. So it's kind of odd that the first time, and they don't even remember that, but I will never.
I was just going to ask you that. Did you ever bring that story up again? Like, hey, you remember the time I met you in Denny's?
Totally. They're like, we do not know what you're talking about. And I remind them, and they're like, oh yeah, of course I remember. And they don't remember. That's the universal, like, what?
They could have been like, but Cyrus, that Denny's been closed for 8 years. Whoa.
Exactly. No, and I think I found out more of the story. Like they weren't going to go to that Denny's, but that Denny's happened to be on the way to the airport, and they were picking up their manager at the time. So it was very, very incidental that they were there. It wasn't just like the place that everybody goes after the show.
If that's not a good advertisement for Denny's at midnight, you can meet your favorite pop punk band.
I mean, for years, you could have met us at a Denny's because that was pretty much, and I mean, it still almost holds true now, although places like Taco Bell have definitely helped. But drive-thrus don't really like vans and trailers, and you can't walk up to them, right? So you need to find your 24-hour diners. And when we were starting out for years, driving ourselves in vans, and you play a show till like 11 or 12, you finally get out of there at midnight, and then you don't have a hotel, but your next show is 8 hours away, so you're just going to drive as far as you can, and then maybe find a Super 8 or something to stay at. So you would always find the Denny's. You would ask everybody, where's the Denny's? Or it's kind of regional, right? When you go to like the Northeast, maybe it's a Friendly's or something if you're in Pennsylvania or somewhere around there, right? Get the ice cream if you can, or even Perkins, or, I mean, they all blend in. So.
That's so fun. But like, as you mentioned, it is so wild to think you went from being a fan, stalking the band at Denny's, to actually being bandmates. Getting to actually like be on stage with Mike and like jamming with him. I mean, that's just wild. Do you recall the first time you actually got to play with Mike?
Yeah, it would have been the first Goldfinger show I ever did. And I mean, that's a whole fun story into itself. But in a nutshell, I was called 4 days before a show. It was a local show here in South Florida. And John Feldman heard that I was, he knew who I was, but he didn't know that I was in South Florida. And he heard through actually SJC drums through Mike, who owns that I was living here, and maybe he should call me. And so he called and was like, "Hey, crazy! I got the show in like 4 days. 4 days. Can you learn like 14 songs? Oh, by the way, there's no time to practice, so you just have to rehearse on your own." I was like, "Okay," and I did. And that was the first time I played with Mike. But it was awesome, and it's so fun to play with him. In general, it's really cool to be on the drums, like the perspective you get, because it's totally opposite. I guess just being on stage, looking out in the crowd, a lot of people don't get to experience that. But drums too, because you're stationary, right? So you always have the same kind of vantage point at every venue, and you get to look out at people. So when the band wants to come hang with you and they're enjoying themselves, it's a good thing. If they want to come hang with you and they're not enjoying themselves, there's something wrong with the show. And they don't want to show people that there's something wrong, but they're kind of trying to get as far away as they can so they come to you, right? But no, when and it's cool. Mike's a professional. All the dudes that I've played with Goldfinger, super pros, and it's really fun to do something other than Newfound Glory. And it's fun because there's a lot of love for what we do in Goldfinger. Yeah. Like John is always promoting Mike being in MXPX, me being in Newfound Glory, or whoever plays and all that stuff. So it's great.
Yeah. I love that Goldfinger has essentially become a super group in a sense. And I mean, Josh Alonis is a legend of all of his work in the producing. Was that the first time you had met Josh, or had you met him before? John. Sorry.
So no, we had met him before probably 2002, 2003, like when things were really going well for us. I watched Goldfinger a whole bunch. I went to his concerts. Here's another person that it's like when I finally got to meet him or at least hang out with him, being on tour with him and stuff. This is only a few years ago, so I've gotten a little bit past my shy stage. But it's like, John, do you realize I totally went to your shows and like I bought your records? And I'll still say Goldfinger Hang-Ups, which is their second, big record. That was like when people talk about what's that record when you were younger? That's like a summer record. It was that record. I remember it came in the spring, and I was in high school, and I jammed that thing. And it's such a unique sounding record. And even he'll say it's. They took chances and it didn't work or whatever, but they got some great songs on that record. Yeah, John's just, he's a crazy dude, but he's a crazy good at everything that he does. And he's a really caring person, which is awesome. He's really loyal, and he's gotten a cool group of people together. In recent years, Charlie, who's the original guitar player of Goldfinger, has come back. Mm-hmm. That's been awesome too, to jam with Charlie. Same thing, to be able to tell him, hey dude, I totally saw you like 25 years ago at the clubs. I was the kid out in the crowd that probably wearing a Korn shirt and shouldn't have been at the show, but I was. Like corduroy jeans and an XL Korn shirt or something. He loves it. He's always said he totally enjoys playing and then watching, and every time I post something on Instagram or YouTube, he's always commenting.
You mentioned there was also another story you wanted to share about another idol that you met.
Yeah, this one's quick, but just as embarrassing, probably. So this would have been around 2002, maybe 2003. So in our career, things were really started happening then. Sticks and Stones would have been out, released. It was it was like successful pretty much worldwide. We had also been traveling to the UK a couple times, Australia, just outside of America, and doing pretty well. And so this happened in the UK. We would have probably already played Reading and Leeds, those festivals, a couple times, which are massive, massive festivals. And there's a publication in the UK called Kerrang. It's a pretty big magazine. Yep. They have an awards show every year, the Kerrang Awards. And I believe we were nominated, maybe like Best New Artist or something like that. We did not win, but that's besides the point. We went to the award ceremony. Now, pretty nuts because this probably was our first award show ever going to. And yes, maybe it was actually televised. I think Kerrang had a channel in the UK for a while, like an MTV type thing. But it was like a who's who of rock. And there's a lot of people we don't know because it's in the UK. So there's a lot of UK artists that we didn't really know. But there's a lot of like big people there. I think Ozzy was there. I think Seal was there.
Seal?
A bunch of people. Yeah, Seal. Whatever. I don't know why. Anyways, we got a whole bunch of pictures. But the cool thing was when we showed up, there were two bands there that we did know and knew very well. Less Than Jake and Finch. Finch was like our little brothers in a sense because they were a drive-through band. They came up a year or two after us. We had probably, if this was like 2002, 2003, we had actually just toured with them. We did a tour, Something Corporate, Finch, You Found Glory, and I don't know who opened that up. Maybe Further Seems Forever or something. Massive tour in the States. So good friends with them. We see them. Oh, this is awesome. We got friends. Let's hang out. This is fine. And then we also see Less Than Jake, who had quickly become friends of ours starting in around 2000 when they brought us on tour. They were like our older brothers. They would show us. They and I will tell it to this day, I will still say, greatest influence we've ever had. Of course, musically, not totally because they have horns and they play, a lot of ska and we don't do that. But it's really more an influence on how to be a band and how to last as a band for 25. I think they're at 25 years now, if not more, right? Still going. So great influence in that sense. But really good friends of ours at that time as well. So it's like, here, we got friends. So at award shows in general, I'm assuming, and especially in the UK, there are libations everywhere. There's and
influences.
There's not everybody in our band is into that kind of stuff, but I was 22 years old. So by the way, in the UK, you can drink at 18. So there's nothing to worry about there. I'm nervous and I start drinking with the Finch guys. I mean, we get absolutely hammered. So with Less Than Jake guys as well, hammered. Less Than Jake guys had pictures that night. We all have pictures, all of us. I met Dave Grohl that night.
Wow.
Wow.
Hero. Like, yeah, I see Dave Grohl. He's got his backs to us. And I did that. I was that guy. I'm that guy a lot, I guess. I was that guy and liquid courage. And I just took him. I spun him around. I think I might have said, excuse me. I was raised to be proper like that, but I doubt it. I probably said, hey, excuse me, after I turned him around. And I just, hey, get a picture with me. I mean, almost headlocked the guy.
Wow.
And I got a picture and he smiled, which is great. I haven't really been able to run into him since. I'm sure it's not because he's like got signs up for me at every concert.
Oh no, there's Newfound Glory. I gotta run.
Exactly. No, and actually a lot of his crew, they started out on the Warped Tour and they were also on the crew when we opened up for Blink, and we ended up taking out a lot of those guys when we went on the Good Charlotte Civic Tour. So it's this crew. We know all the guys, and they're all super cool. Yeah. So Dave Grohl was, he could have reacted very bad, and he didn't. So thankfully.
That's phenomenal.
So that's another example
that's awesome.
of me making a fool of myself, but he was cool. He was cool about it.
I actually loved hearing you talk about just Less Than Jake's influence on you too. And, Matt and I actually, to celebrate Warped Tour's 25th anniversary last year, we each named the three bands that we felt, defined Warped Tour. And to us, Less Than Jake was a no-brainer. And I'm just curious, I mean, as someone who's been on the Warped Tour for many, many times, and you can even argue that Newfound Glory is a band that defines Warped Tour. Which bands would you name as the three that best define what Warped Tour represented?
Less Than Jake has to come up in that conversation, no matter what. I think it's because they did it so many times. I think they played more shows than any other band in Warped Tour history, most likely, or at least they talk about it. And playing it so many times over the span of its career, which is a 25-year career, Less Than Jake grew up with it. But even when they're playing last year or 2 years ago or whatever, these guys are double the age of a lot of the kids out there, but they're still bringing it like they're an 18-year-old kid. And they're still finding ways to connect with the crowd. And that was probably the biggest thing that I ever saw from Less Than Jake was, here is a band that will go play concerts to maybe 400 or 500 kids in a club. But if they played on Warped Tour at like the New York or Jersey stop, that was like, could be 18, 20,000 people. They had t-shirt cannons. They had the toilet paper guns. I mean, and it was DIY stuff. It wasn't like the best thing you could ever find. They figured out how to do this stuff, but they would bring people up on stage. Hey, who wants a haircut today? And they'd shave some kid's head. And it was always the person that didn't really want a haircut, but raised their hand just to be funny. And they would find that person. They would get, two random strangers to get up there and connect on stage, or whatever. And yeah, I mean, some things you probably couldn't even do today, but these are great things that they were doing as far as like just interacting with the crowd to do something to make themselves stand out and not being idiots or like controversial, people having fun. That's what Warped Tour is all about, because Kevin Lyman would always say Warped Tour should be about, and a lot of the like people that were on Warped Tour, the crew members that were on Warped Tour for the longest time, that didn't really have allegiance to bands, they would always say Warped Tour should be about, you go to see your favorite bands, plural. But if you don't leave that day having found something new, you missed out, because that's what Warped Tour is about. There's too much music going on, especially in those last couple of years. Everywhere you turn, there was something. However, on your way walking from one stage to the next, and a lot of times it's from one main stage to the next one because they started spreading them apart, you would pass stuff. And they did this on purpose. We actually asked them one year because we were like, how come we always seem to be on the stage that's like the armpit, the farthest away or whatever? And they're like, sometimes we do that on purpose because you and the other people on your stage, you guys draw a crowd. And what we want to do is get traffic to flow around so that they get to visit everything. So you're not even, inherently it's happening without you even noticing. And you can find some new stuff, because that's what Warped Tour should be about. If you want quickly, what other two bands, I guess, I'll say No Effects, and it goes into Me First and the Gimme Gimmes, because they were able to kind of do the switch and then play probably like 7-8 years in a row, right?
Right.
That third band is a hard band. I almost want to say Flogging Molly. And I'd say that only because it kind of goes back to like the early 2000s, mid 2000s Warped Tour, and they didn't really do much later than that. But for me, that's the Warped Tour heyday. And the reason why I say they're a Warped Tour band was because, like, personally, I don't think I would go out of my way to go see them on a tour. But at Warped Tour, it was so fun to watch them, because they're the punk rock band, but they're a little different because they definitely have the Irish influence and they play a lot of the songs. But people enjoyed it. And that's Warped Tour. I think in some ways, some of those bands were there for you to have a good time. Like the Less Than Jakes would do it and they would surprise you with it. But the Flogging Mollies, you knew what you were getting. That's what you were getting. And Kevin would put them on later in the day for lots of reasons. One of them was because the amount of alcohol consumed by them and everybody, it's unfair to make them play at 11 a.m. He would do that sometimes to bands, but a lot of times that's doing it to a band that he sees is just going nuts, partying the night before. He wants to teach you a lesson. This is a business, and make sure that you can like hold your stuff. So tomorrow I see you falling down drunk tonight. You're playing at 11:30 tomorrow. Well, here's Flogging Molly, who could probably drink him under the table. So he's not going to do that to them. And then the show. And he also wants to watch them and probably sip on a drink himself. So he's going to put him at 6:30 at night because he's done with his day and he wants to hang out on the side of the stage. And so that's cool. And that Warped Tour turned into that for us. That really is the family part where, so like a lot of these people so much that, you're hanging out with them and doing normal things with them, right? You're trying to find that restaurant to go to on the day off, or somebody's figuring out some kind of like barbecue. Yes, we had some like special barbecues. We weren't usually the ones cooking because we were the younger ones, but the No Effects or the Rancids or whatever, they would have these barbecues, and they wouldn't really want everybody at Warped Tour there because there already is a barbecue. They would have their friends with them. And it was really cool because we got invited to hang out at some of these things and, really kind of feel special from a very, very early point in our Warped Tour career. And that's that family feeling stuck with us the entire time we were on that tour.
That's so cool.
Nice.
That's so cool. So before we segue, Matt, do you have